Ethan Harper had everything: wealth, power, and a name that demanded respect. At 42, he was the picture of success, but deep down, he knew something was missing: a child, an heir to carry on his legacy. He'd tried marriage twice, but both ended in bitter failures, solidifying his belief that love was a pointless distraction. That night, as he sat alone in his luxurious penthouse overlooking the city, Ethan's thoughts wandered. Money had always been his solution, and now it would help him with this too. He didn't want the complications of a family or the chaos of relationships. What he needed was an agreement, a cold, calculated transaction to secure an heir without emotional entanglements. The next morning, Ethan drove his sleek black sports car through the bustling downtown streets, his mind already piecing together his plan. As he approached a red light, something unusual caught his attention. Sitting on the sidewalk was a young woman with messy brown hair and tattered clothes. She was hunched over a piece of dirty paper, drawing as though the chaos of the city didn't exist around her. Her piercing blue eyes shone beneath her tangled hair, an odd contradiction to her worn appearance. Ethan shook his head, trying to dismiss the image, but something about her felt different. As the light turned green, he sped away, but a strange pull gnawed at him. A few blocks later, he parked his car and sat staring at the steering wheel. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to himself. Yet he found himself turning the car around and heading back to the corner where he'd seen her. She was still there, sketching with quiet focus. Ethan pulled up to the curb and lowered his window. "Hey, you!" he called out, his tone sharp and direct. "Come here." The woman glanced up, her expression wary as she studied the sharply dressed man in the expensive car. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "I don't have all day," Ethan pressed, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Get in the car." Hesitation lingered in her eyes, but something in his commanding presence made her comply. She stood, clutching her belongings tightly, and climbed into the car. The silence between them was heavy as Ethan drove toward a quiet cafe on the edge of the city. Inside, they sat at a corner table. Ethan wasted no time. "What's your name?" he asked. "Claire Bennett," she replied, her voice firm despite the unease in her posture. "Why do you care?" "Claire," Ethan began, leaning forward, "I have a proposal for you. Hear me out before you call me crazy." Her brow furrowed, but she didn't interrupt. "I want you to have my child," he said, his words precise and void of emotion. Claire froze, her blue eyes wide in disbelief. "Are you serious?" she asked, almost laughing at the absurdity. "Dead serious," Ethan replied, his expression unwavering. It was the strangest, most outrageous thing Claire had ever heard. But as Ethan's intense gaze bore into hers, she realized he wasn't joking. Claire stared at Ethan, her mind racing. This had to be some kind of joke, a twisted, elaborate joke, but the way he sat there, calm and composed, made it clear he was entirely serious. "You're insane," she finally said, leaning back in her chair. "Not at all," Ethan replied smoothly. "I'm a businessman. I see an opportunity and take it. This is a simple arrangement. No drama, no emotions, just a mutually beneficial agreement." Claire let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "And what's in it for me? You get your heir, but I'm just supposed to, disappear afterward?" Ethan folded his hands on the table, his expression cold and calculating. "You'll get financial security. I'll cover all your expenses during the pregnancy, and once the baby is born, you'll receive a substantial sum of money, enough to start a new life anywhere you want. Think of it as a fresh start." Her instinct was to get up and walk away, but the weight of her reality anchored her to the chair. Homeless, with no family, no options, and barely scraping by each day, Claire couldn't deny how tempting his offer sounded. But the idea of carrying a stranger's child, his child, felt like crossing a line she wasn't sure she could handle. "I need time to think," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside her. Ethan nodded, as if he'd anticipated her response. "Of course, you have 24 hours. After that, the offer's off the table." Without another word, he stood and left the cafe, leaving Claire sitting alone with her thoughts. She felt as though a whirlwind had swept through her life in the span of minutes. Ethan returned to his penthouse, pouring himself a glass of whiskey as he stood by the window, gazing out at the city lights. His mind replayed the encounter with Claire. She was rough around the edges, sure, but there was something about her resilience and sharpness that intrigued him. Not that it mattered. This was business, nothing more. Claire, on the other hand, wandered the streets aimlessly, Ethan's words ringing in her ears. She clutched her sketchpad tightly, the only thing she had left of her former life. Was she really considering this? The promise of comfort and security was seductive, but the implications were staggering. By the time the sun rose, Claire had made her decision. She stood outside the imposing building Ethan called home, her heart pounding as the doorman let her in. The elevator ride felt like an eternity, but when the doors opened to Ethan's penthouse, she stepped out with resolve. Ethan was seated at a sleek desk, looking over some documents. He didn't look up immediately, but spoke as if he'd been expecting her. "Well," Claire swallowed hard, forcing her voice to remain firm. "I accept." Ethan finally met her gaze, his expression unreadable. He stood and walked to a nearby table, where a thick folder sat. Picking it up, he handed it to her. "This is the contract. Read it carefully. It's all straightforward, but I want there to be no confusion." Claire took the folder, flipping through pages filled with legal jargon. She didn't understand most of it, but the key points were clear. She'd receive housing, medical care, and financial compensation in exchange for carrying his child and relinquishing all parental rights after the birth. "It's a lot," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "It's fair," Ethan replied. "You'll be taken care of, and we'll both get what we want." Claire hesitated for a moment, then grabbed the pen Ethan had placed on the table. With a deep breath, she signed her name at the bottom of the last page. Ethan took the contract, his sharp eyes scanning it before nodding. "Welcome to the arrangement, Claire." The words felt cold, transactional. As much as she wanted to believe she was making the right choice, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't predict. Later that day, a black sedan pulled up to the curb outside Ethan's building. His assistant, Rachel Collins, stepped out to greet Claire. "Claire," Rachel said warmly, extending her hand, "I'm here to take you to the Harper estate. I think you'll find it comfortable." Claire forced a small smile and followed Rachel into the car. The ride to the estate was silent, but as they passed through the massive iron gates, her breath caught. The mansion was enormous, surrounded by manicured gardens and fountains. It was the kind of place she'd only seen in magazines. "Welcome to your new home," Rachel said, her tone professional. As Claire stepped inside, the grandeur of the interior hit her like a wave: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and endless hallways. But despite the opulence, it didn't feel warm or inviting. She wasn't a guest here, she was part of a deal. Rachel led her to a spacious, meticulously furnished bedroom. "This will be your room," she said, placing a folder on the desk. "Everything you need is detailed here. If you require anything else, let me know." Claire sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the pristine surroundings. She was in a palace, but it felt more like a cage. Meanwhile, Ethan watched from his office, his gaze following Claire's every move through the security monitors. For the first time in a long while, he felt a twinge of doubt. This wasn't supposed to feel complicated, but something about Claire's presence was already beginning to stir something unfamiliar in him. The days at the Harper estate began to blend together for Claire. Her new life was nothing short of surreal. Every need was met before she could even voice it. Meals arrived like clockwork, her room was cleaned daily, and a doctor came by regularly to check on her health. Despite the luxury, it felt hollow. She wasn't a guest. She was part of a business arrangement. Ethan, true to his word, kept his distance. She rarely saw him, and when she did, it was only for brief moments. He was always composed, methodical, and unreadable. Most of her interaction came through Rachel, who ensured Claire stayed on schedule and had everything she needed. It was professional, efficient, and detached. One afternoon, Ethan and Claire crossed paths in the hallway. Claire, carrying a sketchbook Rachel had provided at Ethan's request, froze as he approached. He glanced at her, then at the sketchbook, before stopping. "Are you settling in?" he asked, his voice calm but distant. Claire nodded, unsure what to say. "It's fine. Different." Ethan tilted his head slightly, as though analyzing her response. "If there's anything you need, let Rachel know." And just like that, he walked away. Claire watched him go, frustration bubbling under her skin. This was a man who saw everything as a transaction, including her. But the question that haunted her was, why did that bother her so much? Later that evening, Claire sat in the garden. The estate was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy. She opened her sketchbook and began drawing, letting her mind wander. It was one of the few things that grounded her, a small piece of her old life that still felt real. Ethan, returning from his office, spotted her through the large glass doors leading to the garden. He hesitated for a moment before stepping outside. "You like the garden?" he said, breaking the silence. Claire looked up, startled. "It's peaceful," she replied simply. Ethan nodded, his gaze drifting toward the city lights in the distance. "That's why I had it designed this way. Order brings peace." Claire raised an eyebrow, her voice tinged with sarcasm. "Order doesn't solve everything." He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "It solves enough." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You can plan all you want, but you can't control how you feel. Life doesn't work that way." Her words hung in the air, heavier than she intended. For a moment, Ethan didn't respond. He stood there, his face betraying a flicker of something. Doubt, perhaps, or a realization he didn't want to acknowledge. "You think I don't know that?" he finally said, his tone quieter than before. Claire stared at him, caught off guard by the vulnerability in his voice. But before she could say anything, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The next few days brought subtle changes. Ethan started appearing more often, asking questions about her health and the baby. He even joined her for breakfast once, though the conversation was stilted and brief. Claire couldn't decide if he was genuinely trying to connect or simply monitoring his investment. During a routine doctor's visit, Ethan surprised Claire by insisting on accompanying her. "I want to make sure everything's going as planned," he explained, though his presence felt like more than that. At the clinic, as the doctor moved the ultrasound wand across Claire's abdomen, the sound of a strong, steady heartbeat filled the room. Ethan, standing at her side with his arms crossed, froze. For a man who prided himself on control, the sound seemed to shake him in a way he hadn't anticipated. "It's strong," the doctor said, smiling at Claire. She smiled faintly, her hand resting on her stomach. But when she glanced at Ethan, she saw something different in his face, a crack in his composed exterior. He quickly masked it, but Claire caught it. On the drive back, the usual silence between them felt heavier. Claire couldn't help but break it. "You don't seem like someone who gets surprised easily," she said, her tone light but probing. Ethan sighed, his eyes fixed on the road. I'm not. But this is different. Claire tilted her head, studying him. Why? Because you can't control it. He glanced at her briefly before turning back to the road. Something like that. For the first time, Claire saw a glimpse of the man beneath the businessman. It was fleeting, but it was enough to make her wonder if Ethan Harper was more complex than she'd given him credit for. That night, Claire sat in her room, staring at the blank page of her sketchbook. She thought about Ethan, his cold exterior, his moments of unexpected vulnerability. She couldn't shake the feeling that despite everything, they were both trapped in this strange situation, trying to navigate something far more complicated than they'd planned. Down the hall, Ethan sat in his office, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk. For the first time in years, he felt a tug of uncertainty. Claire's words from the garden echoed in his mind. You can't control how you feel. Weeks passed, and the atmosphere at the Harper estate shifted subtly. Ethan began appearing more frequently during meals or in the garden, his interactions with Claire less rigid and mechanical. Though still guarded, he seemed to study her, as if trying to understand a puzzle he hadn't anticipated. For Claire, the changes were unnerving. She wasn't sure if Ethan's growing presence was a genuine attempt to connect, or just another layer of his calculated approach. Still, she found herself drawn to their exchanges, curious about the man who claimed to value control above all else, yet seemed increasingly unsettled by the life growing inside her. One afternoon, Claire was in the library, flipping through books she had no real interest in reading. It was one of the few quiet spaces where she felt a semblance of independence. Ethan entered, startling her. Didn't mean to interrupt, he said, his tone neutral as always. It's fine, Claire replied, closing the book and setting it aside. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Rachel mentioned you're feeling restless. Claire gave him a pointed look. Do you keep tabs on everything I do? He smirked faintly, the closest she'd seen to a genuine smile. Old habits, comes with running an empire. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan stepped closer, pulling a small, wrapped package from behind his back and placing it on the table. Claire frowned, eyeing it suspiciously. What's this? Open it, he said simply. Inside, she found a new set of sketching supplies, charcoal pencils, high-quality paper, and more. Claire stared at the gift, her throat tightening. You remembered I like to draw, she said softly. You mentioned it once, Ethan replied, his tone casual, though his eyes betrayed something deeper. It seemed like something that could help. Claire's fingers traced the edge of the paper, a mix of gratitude and confusion washing over her. She looked up at him, searching for the catch. Why? Ethan met her gaze evenly. Because it matters to you, and because I don't want you to feel like you're just a part of this arrangement. You're carrying my child, Claire. That means something. The words hung in the air, heavier than either of them anticipated. Before she could respond, Ethan cleared his throat and stepped back toward the door. If you need anything else, let Rachel know, he said before leaving. That night, Claire sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the sketching supplies. For the first time, she felt a crack in the walls she'd built around herself. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to Ethan Harper than the cold businessman she'd first met. Meanwhile, Ethan found himself pacing in his office. He'd spent his life perfecting the art of control, calculating every step, ensuring every outcome. But Claire was different. Her resilience, her honesty, they were things he couldn't predict or manipulate, and that terrified him. A few days later, during a routine doctor's visit, everything changed. Claire lay back as the doctor moved the ultrasound wand across her abdomen. Ethan stood by her side, his usual composed demeanor in place. The steady rhythm of a heartbeat filled the room, but then another sound joined it. "Well," the doctor said, smiling at them, "it seems we missed something last time. You're expecting twins." Claire's eyes widened in shock. "Twins," she whispered, barely able to process the words. Ethan froze, his usually sharp mind failing to grasp the magnitude of what he'd just heard. For a man who thrived on control, this was entirely unexpected. On the drive back to the mansion, the silence between them was unlike any before. Claire finally broke it. "You don't look like someone who gets surprised often," she said, trying to lighten the mood. Ethan let out a dry laugh, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I don't, but this changes things." Claire turned to him, curiosity in her eyes. "How? You planned for a child, now it's two. What's the difference?" Ethan hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It's not just numbers, Claire. This is the first time in my life that I can't plan for what's coming. I can't calculate who these two will become or how they'll change me. It's unsettling." For a moment, Claire saw the man beneath the facade, the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. She didn't respond, unsure of what to say. Back at the mansion, Claire sat in the garden, letting the cool evening air wash over her. Her hands rested on her stomach, and for the first time, she truly felt the weight of what was happening. Two lives growing inside her. It was overwhelming, but it also felt strangely right. Ethan watched her from a distance, standing by the large glass doors. He'd spent his life avoiding connections, building walls to protect himself from vulnerability. But Claire, and now these twins, were slowly breaking through, and he didn't know how to stop it. The news of twins hung in the air like an unspoken agreement neither Ethan nor Claire knew how to handle. Life at the mansion moved forward, but the atmosphere had undeniably shifted. Ethan, once distant and calculated, started appearing more frequently in Claire's daily routine, asking questions about her health, offering small but significant gestures, and even lingering during meals. For Claire, this attention was both unsettling and oddly comforting. Ethan's walls were still firmly in place, but cracks were beginning to show. He wasn't just watching over the pregnancy out of duty. There was something more, though he'd never admit it. One afternoon, Claire sat on a bench in the garden, her sketchbook balanced on her knees. The cool breeze made the quiet estate feel almost peaceful. She was working on a drawing of the twins, as she imagined them, two tiny figures, side by side, sharing a bond she couldn't fully comprehend yet. Ethan approached from the house, his hands in his pockets. "Still drawing?" he asked, his tone softer than usual. Claire glanced up at him, shielding her eyes from the sun. "It helps me think," she replied simply. Ethan nodded, standing a few steps away, as if unsure whether to stay or leave. "You're good at it," he said after a pause. Claire blinked, caught off guard by the compliment. "Thanks. It's been a while since anyone said that." He looked down at the sketchbook, studying the unfinished drawing. "Are those supposed to be the twins?" Claire finished for him, a faint smile on her lips. "It's how I imagine them." Ethan stared at the image, his usually sharp features softening. "Hard to believe, isn't it?" he said quietly. "What?" Claire asked, tilting her head. "That in a few months they'll be real. Here." He motioned toward her stomach, then let his hand drop. Claire saw a flicker of something in his eyes, fear maybe, or vulnerability. It was the first time he'd spoken about the twins with something other than clinical detachment, and it made her chest tighten. "You'll be a good father," she said, surprising even herself with the words. Ethan shook his head, his lips curling into a humorless smile. "I've spent my whole life avoiding connections, Claire. I don't even know where to start." Claire closed her sketchbook, resting it on her lap. Maybe you don't have to plan this. Maybe it's not about control. It's about showing up, being there. Ethan didn't respond, but her words seemed to linger in his mind. He gave her a brief nod and walked back toward the house, leaving Claire to wonder if her words had truly reached him. The following week, Ethan accompanied Claire to another doctor's appointment. This time, he seemed more involved, asking questions and even holding her hand during the ultrasound. The doctor smiled knowingly, sensing the growing bond between them. "You've got two healthy little ones here," the doctor said, pointing at the screen. "They're already quite active." Ethan's grip on Claire's hand tightened as the rhythmic sound of the heartbeats filled the room. He didn't say anything, but Claire could see the emotion flickering behind his eyes. For a man who prided himself on control, this moment was undoing him. Back at the mansion, Ethan's behavior continued to change in subtle ways. One evening, he insisted on helping Claire to the car after dinner. "Are you okay?" he asked, holding the door open. Claire gave him a skeptical look. "Since when do you care about things like this?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Let's just say I'm learning." The small gesture, though seemingly insignificant, stayed with Claire. For the first time, she began to see Ethan not as the cold businessman who'd hired her, but as a man grappling with feelings he didn't understand. Late one night, Claire couldn't sleep. She wandered the halls of the mansion, eventually finding herself outside Ethan's office. The door was slightly ajar, and she peeked inside. Ethan sat at his desk, staring at a photo in his hand. His shoulders were tense, his usual composed posture replaced by something raw and unguarded. She knocked softly on the door. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said, stepping inside hesitantly. Ethan looked up, clearly surprised to see her. He quickly set the photo aside, his expression shifting back to its usual, neutral mask. "It's fine," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Couldn't sleep?" Claire nodded, then gestured toward the photo. "Was that your family?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "My parents. It's been a long time." Claire sat down across from him, her curiosity growing. "You never talk about them." "There's not much to say," Ethan replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Claire leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "Ethan, you don't have to pretend with me. I've seen enough of the real you to know there's more than this," she said, motioning toward the cold exterior he wore like armor. For a moment, Ethan looked as though he might push her away, but then he sighed, his shoulders relaxing. "I guess I'm not used to this. Letting people in. It's easier to keep things controlled, predictable." Claire smiled faintly. "Well, life doesn't care about your plans, Ethan. It just happens." Ethan's lips twitched in the faintest of smiles, and for the first time Claire saw something she hadn't before. A man learning to let go. The dynamic between Ethan and Claire continued to evolve in unexpected ways. Their conversations, once stiff and transactional, had become moments of shared vulnerability. Though Ethan still held onto his walls, Claire could see they were beginning to crumble. And for reasons she couldn't explain, that gave her a strange sense of satisfaction. One afternoon, Claire was sitting in the nursery, a newly designed room filled with everything the twins could possibly need. Rachel had organized the entire project with precision, and yet it felt empty, like a showroom rather than a space for children. Claire traced her fingers along the edge of a crib, imagining the day the room would come alive with laughter and chaos. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his presence quiet but commanding as always. "You're here," he said, stepping inside. Claire turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "It's supposed to be for the twins, isn't it?" Ethan nodded, glancing around the room as if seeing it for the first time. "They spared no expense," he said, his tone flat. Claire laughed softly, shaking her head. Yeah, but it's missing something. Ethan frowned. What? Claire gestured to the pristine walls and perfectly arranged furniture. Life. It's all so perfect. But kids aren't perfect, Ethan. They're messy and unpredictable. This feels like it's waiting for dolls, not real babies. Her words hit him harder than she expected. Ethan walked over to the window, staring out at the garden below. I've spent my whole life perfecting things, he admitted quietly. But you're right. I can't control what they'll bring into my life. I don't even know if I'll be good at this. Claire softened, her usual defenses lowering. You don't have to be perfect, Ethan. You just have to try. And honestly, I think you'll surprise yourself. He turned to her, his gaze lingering for a moment before nodding. Maybe, he said, almost to himself. The next morning, Ethan invited Claire to join him for breakfast, a rare occurrence. The dining room, usually a cavernous and sterile space, felt oddly intimate as they sat across from each other. Ethan had taken to asking her about small things, what she liked to eat, how she spent her mornings, even what books she preferred. For Claire, it was strange seeing him this way, curious and almost approachable. What made you start drawing? Ethan asked as he sipped his coffee. Claire paused, caught off guard by the question. My mom, she said after a moment. She used to draw with me when I was a kid. It was her way of escaping the chaos at home. Ethan leaned forward slightly. And where is she now? Claire's expression darkened. She passed away a few years ago. Cancer. Ethan's brow furrowed, the smallest flicker of sympathy crossing his face. I'm sorry, Claire shrugged, though her voice softened. It's life. You don't get to pick your battles. The words hung between them, and for the first time, Ethan seemed to truly understand the weight Claire carried. A few days later, the doctor confirmed that Claire was entering her final trimester. The news came with mixed emotions, excitement, fear, and a growing sense of inevitability. Claire found herself increasingly attached to the idea of the twins, even as she reminded herself of the terms of their arrangement. One night, as Claire sat in the garden, Ethan joined her. The air was cool, the stars above casting a faint glow over the estate. You come out here a lot, Ethan said, sitting beside her. It's the only place that feels real, Claire admitted. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I get that. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their shared situation pressing down on them. Then, Ethan spoke, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. I never wanted this to be complicated. Claire glanced at him, her expression unreadable. Life doesn't ask for permission to get messy, Ethan. It just happens. He gave her a faint smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. You have a way of making me rethink everything. Claire laughed lightly, but there was a seriousness in her tone. Maybe that's a good thing. Ethan didn't respond immediately, but his silence spoke volumes. For the first time, Claire felt like they weren't just two people bound by a contract. They were two people navigating the unknown together. In the following days, Ethan's behavior continued to change. He began accompanying Claire to every appointment, asking more questions, even attempting to help prepare the nursery. Though he was still Ethan, controlled and guarded, there was a warmth in his actions that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, after a particularly long appointment, Ethan surprised Claire by offering to drive her back to the mansion himself. As they pulled into the estate, Claire turned to him, her curiosity finally getting the better of her. Why are you doing all this? She asked. Ethan glanced at her, his expression uncharacteristically open. Because I don't want to fail them. Or you. The honesty in his voice caught Claire off guard. For a man who once treated her as nothing more than a part of a transaction, Ethan was becoming someone she barely recognized. And though she would never admit it aloud, she didn't hate the change. The mansion buzzed with a quiet anticipation as Claire's due date crept closer. Every corner seemed prepared for the arrival of the twins, from the nursery filled with soft blankets and toys to the kitchen stocked with nutritious meals Rachel insisted would help Claire through recovery. Yet, despite all the preparations, the emotional complexity of the situation weighed on both Ethan and Claire. Ethan's demeanor had softened further in recent weeks. He no longer approached Claire with just questions about her health or the babies, but seemed genuinely invested in her thoughts and feelings. His once impersonal glances now lingered, and the man who thrived on control was slowly learning to live in the unknown. One evening, Claire was in the living room, sketching again, when Ethan walked in. He carried 2 glasses of sparkling water and set one in front of her before taking a seat nearby. "Drawing them again?" he asked, motioning to the page. Claire nodded. "I can't stop imagining what they'll look like. Will they take after you, me, both?" Ethan studied the drawing, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "They'll be perfect, no matter what," he said simply. Claire looked up, surprised by the warmth in his voice. "You've changed, Ethan," she said softly. He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe I have. Or maybe I'm just finally seeing things differently." Claire tilted her head, watching him closely. "You're scared, aren't you?" Ethan didn't answer right away, but his silence spoke volumes. Finally, he nodded. "Terrified. I've spent my life building walls, Claire. Walls that kept me safe, that kept things predictable. But now, with them, I don't even know where to start." Claire smiled, her voice gentle. "You'll figure it out. You already are." A few days later, Claire woke up to sharp pains in her abdomen. At first, she thought it might just be discomfort from the pregnancy, but as the contractions grew stronger, she realized it was time. She called out for Rachel, who quickly summoned Ethan. Within minutes, the entire household sprang into action. Ethan, uncharacteristically frantic, was at Claire's side as she was helped into the car. "We're going now," he said firmly, his voice laced with urgency. The drive to the hospital was a blur of emotions. Claire focused on breathing through the pain while Ethan sat beside her, holding her hand tightly. It was the first time he'd openly shown such vulnerability, and though she was in agony, Claire couldn't help but notice the shift in him. "We're almost there," he said softly, his grip never loosening. At the hospital, the delivery room was a flurry of activity. Claire barely registered the voices of the nurses and doctors as the contractions intensified. Ethan stayed by her side the entire time, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos. And then the moment came. A loud, piercing cry filled the room as the first baby was born, a boy. Claire felt a wave of relief and emotion wash over her, but before she could fully process it, another cry joined the first. A girl. The nurses carefully cleaned and wrapped the babies in blankets, bringing them closer for Claire to see. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at the tiny, perfect faces of her children. "They're beautiful," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, his usually composed demeanor completely undone. Slowly, he stepped closer to Claire, his eyes fixed on the twins. "You were incredible," he said softly, taking her hand. Claire turned to him, their eyes meeting in a moment of unspoken understanding. For all the complications, the doubts, and the walls between them, this was real. This was something neither of them could have prepared for. That night, while Claire rested in her hospital room, Ethan stood by the nursery window, watching the twins as they slept. The weight of everything hit him all at once. The magnitude of being a father, the vulnerability he'd fought so hard to avoid, and the overwhelming love he already felt for these tiny lives. Rachel appeared quietly beside him, handing him a cup of coffee. "They're perfect," she said, her voice soft. Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving the twins. "They are, and they deserve everything." Rachel glanced at him, a knowing smile on her lips. "Sounds like you're ready to give it to them." For once, Ethan didn't argue. Claire and the twins returned to the Harper mansion 2 days later, greeted by a quiet but palpable sense of celebration. Rachel had ensured everything was in perfect order, down to the tiniest detail, and the staff had left flowers and notes of congratulations throughout the house. Despite the grandeur of her surroundings, Claire felt a growing ache in her chest. The contract's terms loomed over her like a shadow, and the thought of leaving the twins, of leaving this life, was more painful than she had anticipated. Ethan, on the other hand, had transformed in ways even he didn't fully understand. He spent every waking moment around the twins, learning how to hold them, feed them, and calm their cries. His once sterile demeanor had been replaced by a quiet devotion that surprised everyone, including himself. One afternoon, Claire found him in the nursery, standing over the cribs with a look of pure awe. The twins were asleep, their tiny faces peaceful, and Ethan seemed completely absorbed in the moment. "You're a natural," Claire said softly, stepping into the room. Ethan glanced at her, his expression uncharacteristically tender. "I never thought I'd feel like this," he admitted. "It's overwhelming, but in the best way." Claire leaned against the doorway, her arms crossed. "They've changed you, Ethan, for the better." He smiled faintly, then turned serious. "And you? How are you feeling?" Claire hesitated, knowing the truth was too complicated to explain. "I'm fine," she said, her voice betraying the emotions she tried to suppress. Ethan didn't push her, but her answer lingered in his mind. Days turned into weeks, and the mansion slowly adjusted to the chaos of newborns. Claire found herself increasingly torn. She adored the twins more than she thought possible, and every moment with them felt like a gift. But the contract loomed over her like a ticking clock, a reminder that this life wasn't hers to keep. One evening, after putting the twins to bed, Claire sat in the garden, staring up at the stars. She didn't hear Ethan approach until he was sitting beside her. "You've been quiet lately," he said, breaking the silence. Claire sighed, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "It's hard not to think about what's coming." Ethan turned to her, his gaze steady. "You mean the contract?" She nodded, her throat tightening. "I knew what I was agreeing to, Ethan, but now, after everything, it's harder than I thought it would be." For a moment, Ethan said nothing. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the contract, the same one she had signed months ago. "I've been thinking about this too," he said, his voice low. Claire's heart raced as he held up the document. "What are you doing?" Ethan looked at her, his expression soft but resolute. "I've spent my whole life avoiding connections, trying to control everything. But these past few months, they've shown me how wrong I've been. I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." Before Claire could respond, Ethan tore the contract in half, letting the pieces fall between them. "You're not leaving, Claire, not unless you want to. But if you stay, it won't be because of an agreement. It'll be because you want this as much as I do." Tears welled up in Claire's eyes as the weight of his words sank in. For the first time, she saw the real Ethan Harper. A man willing to let go of his control for the sake of something bigger than himself. That night, Claire lay awake in her room, her mind racing. Ethan's gesture had shaken her, but it also left her with an overwhelming sense of hope. she thought of the twins, of the life they could have together. And for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future that felt whole. In the nursery, Ethan stood by the cribs, watching the twins sleep. His heart felt full in a way he hadn't known was possible. He knew that his decision to tear up the contract had been the right one, but now it was up to Claire to decide what came next. The morning after Ethan tore up the contract, Claire woke with a heavy mix of emotions swirling inside her. She had spent the night replaying his words, his actions, and the raw vulnerability he had shown. The thought of staying felt both comforting and terrifying. In the nursery, Ethan was already with the twins, gently rocking the baby boy in his arms, while the girl cooed softly in her crib. Claire paused in the doorway, watching him. It was such an unfamiliar sight. Ethan Harper, the once impenetrable businessman, now a devoted father, his entire focus on two tiny lives. "You're up early," Claire said, stepping inside. Ethan looked up, a rare warm smile softening his features. "They don't exactly give me much choice," he replied, his tone light. Claire walked over to the crib, picking up the baby girl and cradling her close. For a few moments, the two of them stood in silence, their attention entirely on the twins. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice hesitant. "What you did last night, tearing up the contract, it meant a lot to me." Ethan glanced at her, his expression serious. "It wasn't just for you, Claire. It was for all of us. I can't imagine this family without you in it." Her breath caught at the word family. It was something she hadn't dared to dream about for herself in years, but hearing it from Ethan made her chest tighten with a mix of fear and longing. Later that day, Ethan suggested they take the twins outside for the first time. The garden, usually quiet and serene, felt alive as the babies reacted to the soft sunlight and the gentle rustle of leaves. Claire watched as Ethan carefully laid out a blanket on the grass and placed the twins down, his movements filled with a tenderness that still surprised her. "You're really good at this, you know," Claire said, sitting beside him. Ethan chuckled softly, his gaze on the twins. "Honestly, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm trying." Claire smiled, her heart warming at his honesty. "That's all that matters." For a while, they sat in companionable silence, watching the twins wiggle and coo. But the unspoken tension between them lingered, and finally Claire turned to Ethan. "Why did you change your mind? About me? About all of this?" Ethan took a deep breath, his eyes still on the twins. "Because you changed me, Claire. I didn't expect it, and I fought it for a long time, but you made me see things differently. For the first time in my life, I realized there are things I can't calculate or control, and that's okay. You made me want more than just an heir or a legacy. You made me want a real family." Claire felt her throat tighten, tears threatening to spill. "I was so scared when I agreed to this," she admitted, "but now I can't imagine walking away, not from them or from you." Ethan turned to her, his expression soft but resolute. "Then don't. Stay, Claire. Not because of the contract, but because you want this as much as I do." She stared at him, her heart pounding. In that moment, she saw the man Ethan had become, not the cold, calculating businessman, but someone willing to embrace the messy, unpredictable beauty of life. "I want this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I want all of it." That evening, as the sun set over the Harper estate, Claire and Ethan sat together in the nursery, the twins sleeping peacefully in their arms. The future no longer felt uncertain or frightening. It felt like a promise, a new beginning for all of them. For the first time in years, Claire felt like she had found a place she belonged, and Ethan, for all his planning and control, finally understood that some of the best things in life couldn't be calculated. They simply had to be embraced. The days following Claire's decision to stay were filled with a sense of peace and purpose. The Harper mansion, once a place of cold efficiency, now felt alive. The twins brought a rhythm to their days, a constant cycle of feedings, naps, and the occasional meltdown that left both Claire and Ethan laughing despite their exhaustion. Ethan, who once avoided vulnerability at all costs, was now fully immersed in fatherhood. His confidence grew with each passing day, from changing diapers to rocking the twins to sleep. For Claire, it was both heartwarming and surreal to see how much he had changed. This man, who once treated her like a mere part of a transaction, had become someone she trusted deeply. One sunny afternoon, Ethan invited Claire and the twins to the garden for what he described as a small surprise. When she stepped outside, she was greeted by an intimate setup, a picnic blanket surrounded by flowers with the twins' favorite toys scattered around. Ethan stood beside the setup, holding a bottle of sparkling water and 2 glasses. "What's all this?" Claire asked, smiling as she approached. Ethan shrugged, a rare sheepishness in his expression. "Just thought we could enjoy the day together, celebrate us." Claire placed the twins on the blanket, watching as they wiggled happily in the sunlight. Ethan handed her a glass and raised his own. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice soft but filled with meaning. Claire clinked her glass against his, her heart full. "To family," she replied. As the sun began to set, bathing the garden in a golden glow, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Claire's breath caught as he opened it, revealing a delicate ring. "Claire," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "you came into my life in the most unexpected way. What started as a plan turned into something I never thought I'd have, a family. I don't want to spend another day without you by my side, not as part of a contract, but as my partner. Will you marry me?" Tears welled up in Claire's eyes as she stared at the man who had changed so much, not just for her, but for their family. She nodded, unable to speak at first, then whispered, "Yes." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a tight embrace. The twins cooed softly on the blanket, as if sensing the joy surrounding them. The wedding was a simple yet beautiful ceremony held in the garden. Only a handful of close friends and staff attended, including Rachel, who had become more than just an assistant. She was family. Claire wore a simple, elegant dress, and Ethan looked every bit the doting father and devoted partner. As they exchanged vows, Ethan's voice trembled slightly. "You've taught me that life isn't about control or perfection. It's about love, messiness, and the unexpected. I promise to embrace all of it with you." Claire's response was equally heartfelt. "You've shown me that it's okay to trust again, to believe in something bigger than myself. I promise to stand by you through all of it." When they kissed, the small gathering erupted in applause, the sound mingling with the soft laughter of the twins nearby. Months later, on a warm afternoon, Ethan and Claire sat in the garden watching the twins play on a soft mat. Their laughter filled the air, pure and infectious. Claire turned to Ethan, who was sitting beside her with a contented smile. "Are you happy?" she asked softly. Ethan glanced at her, then at the twins, and nodded. "More than I ever thought I could be." Claire leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. For the first time, neither of them felt the weight of their past decisions or fears. They had built something real, something that mattered more than either of them had anticipated. As the screen fades to black, a heartfelt message appears. If this story moved you, there are more like it waiting for you on our channel, True Impressive Stories. Don't forget to check the pinned comment for a special link to our community. Share your thoughts and let us know where you're watching from. See you in the next story.